Morning, James.
Morning, Tim.
So I'm Tim Kirby, Chief Executive Officer of Releaf, and I'm sat today with James Duckenfield. James, what do you do?
I'm the Chief Executive of Glass Pharms.
So we talk a lot about the space that we'll call medical cannabis in the UK. And so we thought we'd sit down to do it in front of a camera and some microphones and see if some of the things that we bring up resonate with perhaps a wider audience. Shall I start with how we met and Releaf's journey, and then if you build on that with a bit of reciprocation for Glass Pharms? Is that a good starting point?
Yeah.
So it's well documented, and I've given many interviews around how we looked at the market that stagnated for 6 years since legalisation in 2018. And we looked at the incumbents, and there's no other way to put it. They were the root cause of the stagnation. I think that they were activists. I think they saw many of them as a Trojan horse for legalisation. I think some of the incumbents that were deemed to be my peers are enthusiasts, shall we say, for the subject matter. I think they think we should be walking to Parliament with pitchforks. It should be in the water at school, and it's for the greater good of mankind. And I think they were spending a lot of effort and time in an ability that I'll loosely call going to market effectively, because clearly it hasn't been very effective because it hasn't worked for 6 years, trying to sell cannabis. And I gave an interview with the Times before Christmas, and they referred to it as chasing the wrong football. Right? It's not about selling cannabis. It's about providing a healthcare need. And what happened when we went to market in February last year, 2024, having spent well north of 7 figures of our own money, building a technology platform and a go-to-market strategy, what we didn't realise was just how broken the supply chain was. And so we launched in February, very soft launch, minimal marketing. And as you know, in March we launched, and I think we refunded £60,000 to patients because they'd gone onto our platform, they'd seen a specialist doctor, they'd been given a prescription, only to find out as soon as we started doing several hundred all at once, the market couldn't cope in terms of the supply chain. And I think that's when we met.
That's right.
And so how did you come as a scientist by heritage?
Yes.
Are you not?
I train as a chemist, and I've spent most of my career in technology. So started a number of businesses, worked in some big corporations, and I sold a legal technology business in 2020. But I'd invested in the sector and got interested in medical cannabis for the UK because I just like you, I saw that it was a market which really wasn't being served well. And I think in the early days, there were cases of moldy products entering the supply chain. I remember going into one of our customers and finding a bag of product that had been imported that was full of spider mite. And I thought, this just really isn't.
What's spider mite?
Spider mites are little invertebrates which can be a pest for cannabis.
Right, not something you want in your medication.
Definitely not something you want in your medication. So we thought, we've got an opportunity to provide a domestic supply chain for CBPMs, which is reliable in terms of supply and reliable in terms of quality, and really apply some science to a sector where there wasn't very much scientific rigor being applied to growing and preparing medical cannabis flower. So one of my bugbears, and I've seen it lots in my career, is that British companies tend to do things on a bit of a shoestring when they start up, and then they anticipate that they're going to be able to get their funds then to scale up at some point in the future. But it very rarely works like that. And then an American business will come along, they'll invest properly, they'll do it right first time, and they'll outcompete the British company. I was determined not to do that. So we went off and raised a large amount of money, £26.5 million, which for a startup is quite punchy.
How long did that take?
Actually, it was remarkably quick. So we did it completely the opposite to everybody else. So we went and got the license first, right, and then we raised the money and built the facility afterwards, rather than building a facility and hoping to get a license. They're incredibly difficult to get, requires a lot of diligence, And so we did it that way around.
So, James, when you went out to investment, did the sector hold any stigma, or was it difficult to get some interest at the early days?
Yeah, completely. So I think once we'd established that we were talking about medical cannabis, not CBD, and that we'd covered off the Proceeds of Crime Act side of things, then actually the investors could see that the market's growing. They could see that it's grown very fast in Germany, in Australia, in Canada, and that and Europe, and particularly the UK, has been underinvested in the marketplace. So there's so much growth yet to happen that now is a good time to invest. So we were able to convince all of the investors who we spoke to give us all of the money. And actually only one of them qualified out because they had a conflict of interest with another investment.
So everybody that you'd approached all offered you all of the money?
Yes.
That's a nice Dragon's Den moment.
It is.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know how far down this road we want to go, but the reasons for the stagnation in 6 years, I talked about chasing on football, and I talk about it being enthusiasts of the product, shall we say. And there was always what I couldn't understand. There was this desire for all these weird and wonderful strains that the clinics, before we entered the market and before you entered the market.
Yes.
Infamously, there's one around at the moment. What's it called? Fuck around and find out, right? And how you square that circle with a medical proposition. Do you think that has been the root cause, and do you think it alienates patients?
I think there's some patients who are looking for that, but I think they're patients who are looking for not a medical outcome. They're looking for a recreational outcome.
Okay.
And I think you and I are both in the medical space and are looking for a medical outcome. So when we looked at Cultivars for the business, we wanted to make sure that we had a broad spectrum of terpene combinations so that clinicians could pick from a list of products which gave that spectrum of terpene combinations and different strengths of THC. So we have a CBD flower, we have a balanced flower, and then a range of THC flowers of different concentrations, but with different terpene profiles, so that clinicians can choose the right medicine for their patient.
Because certainly, when we started working with you, that was a tipping point for us. That we suddenly had consistency and continuity of supply. We had great communications from the start in terms of we would forecast patient volumes, you would grow to our patient volumes, and we were able to start supporting patient treatment plans, because ultimately you want consistency of supply, because if you found a medication, any medication, just not in the medical cannabis space, that works for you, you want to be able to go back and get it.
Yes.
And this has been one of the problems. And I also speak to doctors in our clinic, and you'll go to the market that was, and I like to think of a marketplace before Glass Pharm and Releaf and a marketplace post Glass Pharm and Releaf. And that marketplace before Glass Pharm and Releaf, when I spoke to doctors, they would actually give a patient a menu with up to 100 different cannabis cultivars and ask them to choose. And in a medical environment, doctors, I think, are nervous enough trying to provide one unlicensed medication without having such a wide range to choose from.
Yes.
And we certainly, in our formulary, we have no more than 16 different cultivars that our doctors provide. And I think you represent 12 of those, some of that order. And we're doubling and redoubling every month. And we see it in Trustpilot. And I would encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast, go to Releaf's Trustpilot, and you'll see the unbelievable outcomes that patients experience. And one of the things that you'll read very often is that celebration of the consistency of supply that they weren't able to get, as I say, pre-Releaf, pre-Glass Pharm. And we're getting through you now, I don't know, north of 100 kilos and doubling 20% growth probably month on month whenever we come back to order. And you were talking about your facility and how you were starting to raise the money. What did you want that facility to look like when you got the £26 million?
Yeah, so we identify what the problems were with the supply chain and then design the facility to overcome those problems. So I mentioned the mold and
the spider mites.
spider mites. So we looked at what are the problems with medical cannabis. They're clearly bad for patients, but they're also bad commercially, because if you have, having a product recall is a very expensive process. It's also really bad for your reputation, and it's clearly bad for patients. So we designed the facility from scratch with a fanatical attention to detail on making sure that there couldn't be contamination of the product. We have fanatical attention to detail around microbes, both bacteria and fungi. And we also decided we didn't want any pesticides. So we actually use integrated pest management, which means that we are deploying invertebrates, different insects, to go on patrol to make sure that there's no pests in the greenhouse. So what we're really designed to deliver is a really clean product at the end of the growing cycle.
And it's fair to say, it's not that sorry to interrupt you, the investment, they were very clear that they wanted this to be a long-term play. There was no pressure for
Exactly.
a short-term.
So
what's their sort of forward view?
So that we haven't gone to a traditional private equity house. We've gone to an investor actually with a 15-year investment horizon. So our facility is funded over 15 years. There's a real focus on building a business for the future rather than building a business to make a quick buck.
And what we've seen, and I guess we can say here now, we were talking last week that we want to get some patients down to see the facility. I can only speak, personally from my own experience. It's one of the most impressive facilities I've ever been to in any sector, and I believe that you've had similar feedback from people that are very experienced at seeing growing facilities. And,
yes.
I don't want to make you feel too uncomfortable, but it's been incredibly positive.
Yes.
In terms of mentioned as the best they've seen in the world. Is that a fair piece of feedback that you've received from those that know?
It is. And I think the reason that it's unusual is that it's a continuous cultivation facility.
What does that mean?
So most growing establishments will grow a whole section of a greenhouse, or they'll grow a whole grow room, and they'll end up with batches of plants that are grown in a static position. Our environment is very different to that, in that it's continuous cultivation. So every day we're planting, every day we're managing the plants, every day we're harvesting.
Right.
So we're dealing with lots of small batches essentially, and we can have the attention to detail that a craft manufacturer would have, but in a highly industrialized methodology. So the plants travel on 5 meter by 1.5 meter aluminium trays that were designed specifically for us. And they go on a 14 to 16 week journey from the beginning of the grow process to the end of the grow process through different climate chambers which simulate the year. So we have a chamber for spring, we have a chamber for summer, and a chamber for autumn. And little baby plants go in that were derived from something in a test tube at one end to mature flowers at the other.
And it's fair to say you were the first domestic UK producer by some timeline, were you not?
Actually, medical cannabis has been grown in the UK for a long time, but not for flower. Right. So GW Pharmaceuticals were the first to grow commercially, but they were growing to extract flower. And as you know, we are growing flowers to be consumed by vaporization. And so the quality of the flower needs to be a much higher level.
Right. Oh, so this is places like up in Norfolk where I've been. It's a very much more agricultural process.
Yes.
Than we'd find.
Exactly.
And that's because of the nature that they're growing for extraction.
Indeed.
Just in case our listeners don't know, what does extraction, when you say that, what does it mean?
So it means that you're growing the plant gets turned into pellets.
I saw bales of pellets there when I was there.
Yes. So the pellets then get extracted, the cannabinoids then get recombined into the formulation for medicine, and then they're producing a licensed product, and they're by far the largest medical cannabis licensed medicine producer in the world.
But they're producing a very, very different product to you. It doesn't have the psychoactive.
So we were the first to grow flower for CBPM, so cannabis-based products for medicinal use in humans, as legalized in 2018.
Okay. What's interesting is certainly when we first embarked on this as Releaf, because of the subject matter, I've got lots of friends, family in my network that have shown no interest whatsoever in what I've ever done for a living, pretty much. Everybody got very interested very quickly.
Yes.
And I think one of the first surprises people have to get over is that there's no combustion involved. Right.
That's right.
So we would use a phrase, responsible dosage control without combustion. So can you explain how you actually get the efficacious nature of the medical cannabis? How does it actually work at a patient level?
Yeah, so smoking cannabis for medical purposes is illegal.
And it was explicitly illegal in the legislation of 2018.
That's right. So the legal way to take medical cannabis flower is to load it into a medical inhaler. The medical inhaler then heats up the flower to typically between 180 and 200 degrees.
Right.
That then vaporizes the active ingredients, which are a combination of cannabinoids and typically terpenes. There are some other compounds in there as well, and those are the compounds that give you the medical benefit.
So it's heat not burn.
It's heat not burn,
and it's the heat that allows the active ingredients that produce the healthcare impact to be taken by the patient.
That's right.
And it's done by inhaling it.
That's right, and that's why contamination control is so important.
Right.
So we're producing really clean cannabis flower without irradiation, with a UK supply chain that's very transparent and controlled, without it going through lots of different intermediaries.
Okay. And that goes back to that combustion nature and smoking cannabis. I've got some stories that came from patients of ours that you're familiar with, because I would have mentioned them before, but for the sake of our audience, that I had a patient who was in palliative care. The lady, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And for those that don't know, medical cannabis can be very useful for people in palliative care. They suffer from ruminations, what's happening next and what's going on. And nighttime can be a terrifying time. And also with chemotherapy, you lose your appetite, and cannabis can stimulate your appetite, and it can help you sleep. And there was a lady in palliative care, and she was at a chemo class and spoke to one of our patients, who was very pleased with the effects that the medical cannabis was having. And this lady decided to do some research, and she stumbled across a patient group, and she relayed it to me because she actually took a picture of the screen on her phone, and it was a chap in a Gandalf hat playing with Pokemon cards, smoking a bong, and representing a patients association.
Yes.
So it sort of takes me back to this reason for stagnation of the marketplace for 6 years. I think the industry hasn't done itself any favours. We talked about the names of some of these cultivars that people bring in that perhaps aren't opening demographics that would be cannabis naive. And across your portfolio, and clearly Releaf's not your only customer, what are you seeing happening in the market in terms of growth at the moment?
So, I mean, the UK market is definitely growing and growing at pace. I think there's a number of reasons why the UK has not grown to the same pace as somewhere like Australia. And part of that is legislation, part of it is customer service, part of it is consistency and quality of the product that's being consumed. And I think there's been this revolving door of people coming into medical cannabis having frustrations, whether it be from the customer service or from the product, and then resorting to using black market cannabis, which is clearly not in anybody's interest.
And it's a very different product than would leave Glass Farm.
Completely. I mean, the cosmetically, it may look similar.
Yeah.
But in terms of control and safety, it's worlds apart. The product that we're producing is incredibly well controlled in every aspect of its life, whereas who knows what happens in the black market.
And does that take us back to, you touched on proceeds of crime, that a product that's sold for recreational purposes, which is an illegal activity in the UK,
yes,
merely granting it an import licence doesn't suddenly turn it into a medication.
That's right.
And the MHRA is the governing body that allows import of cannabis.
Well, it's actually jointly regulated by the Home Office. So the Home Office grants import licenses, and the MHRA also vet the imported medicines. So they grant permission to import, and the Home Office will grant an import license for a Schedule 1 or 2 controlled drug.
And neither of us have a crystal ball, but do you think the Home Office at some point are going to stop people importing cannabis that's used for recreational purposes in another territory?
Well, I think there's a legitimate need to import medicines.
Yeah.
I think the patients will eventually run out for products that are clearly recreational products being imported and represented as medical products.
Right. I don't know if I mentioned it before. Interesting names like Fuck Around and Find Out, you'll find clinics providing. And I think that fundamentally alienates the millions and millions and millions of people that could benefit from cannabis-based products for medical use in humans. And if you look at some of the numbers, right, so in any other territory, 3% of the adult population will have a medical cannabis prescription. You know, that's 3.5 million people then in the UK. There's arguably, what's your number, 50,000 patients in the UK?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. And if I look at what Releaf's done in opening up that demographic, by not trying to sell cannabis, but trying to deliver healthcare solutions and exceptional healthcare outcomes, this month we grow 25% month on month. We've got 2,400 half an hour initial consultations available with our clinic, which today has 26 doctors in it. And I don't know if this is good or bad. If you went onto our website today, I think the earliest you can see a doctor now is Wednesday next week. We released 200 additional slots week 3 of February for the last week in February, and they filled in 1 hour.
Wow.
So, you know, there's something going on. I see it in the doctor community as well. When did we come down with our doctors to Glass Pharms?
May time, I think.
It could have been May, because that was another moment for us, because certainly when we launched, we were told, we didn't realise the supply chain was as broken as it was, and we were told that you'll find it really, really difficult to get doctors. Well, we went to some of the online forums where doctors exist. We posted some adverts, we conducted some webinars. Releaf's Chief Operating Officer, Graham Woodward, who was the second person in the UK to ever prescribe medical cannabis in the UK, gave an impassioned representation to doctors that were cannabis naive. And we had, I can't remember the number, 10, 11, 12 sign up instantly. And doctors want this portfolio career. So they want to be 4 days a week with the National Health Service and a day a week doing something else. And so that 1 day a week, I remember we brought however many it was, let's say it was a dozen doctors to Glass Pharm. Your team very kindly gave them the tour.
Yes.
And I remember the reaction. You know, they were absolutely blown away about what they were able to engage with and see, the level of technology, the clean space, that we were all in head to toe in gowns and beard nets and hair nets. And the very next day, we doubled the capacity within Releaf's clinic.
Yes.
Because all the doctors, it gave them belief, it gave them trust and confidence. I don't know how you reflect on the visits that take place.
As you know, my wife's a doctor, and quite a lot of my personal friends are doctors as well. And they are, in their professional lives, very conservative typically. And I think the important thing to understand with cannabis-based products for medicinal use in humans, CBPMs, is that they are unlicensed medicines, and therefore the ultimate risk for prescribing the medicine sits with the physician.
Right.
And therefore, the physician being comfortable that this is something that they should be prescribing to their patient is absolutely fundamental. Another
thing that we're trying to work on, and I know you're very, very supportive as well, is outcomes. How do we create closed loop feedback to doctors so that it gives them increased confidence in how they're prescribing medication to certain types of patients? So what we've done, we've invested in 15 different patient-reported outcome measures. These are recognised in the healthcare sector. They're condition-specific. And it's a feedback loop where at least every 90 days, we're going to engage with our patient community, and they're going to complete these PROMs, as they're called, patient-reported outcome measures. and we can start to create data points that support the story.
Yes.
And then when we have a patient doing what I talked to you of before, where we're trying to create education and awareness through this feel, felt, found message, we can then start to support that with data. And what was really exciting just this week is the John Hopkins Institute in Baltimore. They saw that we had embedded into our technology platform patient-reported outcome measures, and they're super keen to talk to us about how they can engage and what are these data points that we're trying to collect. I don't know, what data points do you see in the world?
The NICE, the NHS, the government keep on asking for more research to be done on safety and efficacy. And in my mind, the safety side of medical cannabis is very well understood. It's a product that's been used for thousands of years. It's being used by millions of people around the world. If there were safety issues, they would be very apparent by now. Efficacy is another matter, and so I think collecting real world evidence, feeding that back, us being able to improve products in a particular way, and seeing what effect that has on patients is a really virtuous loop. And the only way you can collect that real world evidence from patients against particular ailments is if there is a consistent product against which to compare it. Yep. So if patients are switching products on a regular basis, or the products that they have available to them changes every week, then it's impossible to start building that body of evidence, because you'll look at the results from a particular patient cohort and say, okay, well, what medication were they taking? And unless that medication is consistent and throughout their treatment, how can you possibly start building a body of evidence that means anything?
And it's so obvious to say, but it's been wholly unavailable. We found it last March. We broke the supply chain because there wasn't enough consistency and quality of supply. And bringing those data points where we can take the anecdotes that you see in Trustpilot about how it's changed my life, my quality of life has improved, and use these recognised healthcare sector questionnaires that really get us at sort of some quantitative analysis, and it's supported, obviously, has to be by consistency of the medication.
Stuff that starts with anecdotal feedback can start being used more seriously. So doctors will get used to prescribing particular medications, patients will get used to particular medications, and very quickly we'll start performing a body of evidence to say, actually, this particular cultivar isn't particularly good for this ailment, but it's really good for this one.
Absolutely.
And that body of evidence will grow, but can only grow because of the consistency in prescribing approach and the consistency in the product.
And scale. You want more than 10 people in the cohort. So with us boarding on, Releaf now, as I said earlier, 2,400 in March, we'll get to 5,000 a month come June. You're starting to get some really meaningful volumes of patients in there across the range of medicines, so we can start to really surface those conclusions. And I'm really excited to share that back with you and your colleagues at Glass Pharms as soon as we start to see it.
So I think the doctors coming in, seeing where it's produced, and it's being produced to a very high quality standard is really important, but also that the product is consistent. So the strains, the cultivars aren't changing every 5 minutes, that they're produced in a common way each time.
But each part, whenever you've got a new group of seedlings, we've got some new seedlings, they need to turn out as a medication exactly the same as the last one that was the same thing. So, explain how that works.
So seeds are a dirty word, actually, in our facility. So we don't grow from seed at all.
Okay.
So because seeds harbour diseases. So we grow everything from tissue culture. So just like Dolly the sheep, all of our plants for a particular cultivar are exact clones of each other.
Right.
So we achieve genetic consistency by using clones.
And that comes back to this consistency and quality of a medication, because you want to be able to guarantee that to a patient.
Whereas actually, if you buy when in our early days, when we were looking for the right cultivars for our facility, if you buy a bag of seeds, you can guarantee that you'll end up with multiple versions of the thing that you thought you bought. And in some cases, you'll end up with something that bears no resemblance to the thing you thought you bought. So in our view, and this may change in the future, but at the moment, the only way to get really consistent results is to grow from tissue culture and grow exact clones for a particular cultivar.
And again, I know you read them, I read them. I know the people that are in our networks and the people that work in our organisations read them. We've got nearly 1,000, I think now, Trustpilot reviews.
Yes.
I don't say this out of arrogance, but we're the most trusted clinic in the UK. That's just a matter of record. Go to Trustpilot and see the reviews and how many of those are 5-star. We have the greatest level of patient advocacy. What do I mean by that? If we measure that in the number of reviews we get each week. And I think that's fundamentally down to the quality of medication that we're able to provide from Glass Pharms.
Yes.
That unmet healthcare need has never been able to be serviced in the way it is today. And I'm not overstating that, I don't think.
No.
Since Glass Pharms brought it to market.
I think the fact that we stick to cultivars that we know work in our facility and that we can produce them the same all the way through the year because we've got such a fanatically controlled environment is really important.
Talk more about that, because I can't remember. Aren't you next door to some? You don't pay for something, do you? Is it your hot water?
So since I was 17, I've been very keen on the environment way before it was trendy.
Right.
I've never been particularly trendy.
James, you do yourself a disservice.
Yeah. So I wanted, if we're building something from scratch, I wanted it to be eco-friendly, and there's no reason why businesses can't be eco-friendly and have a commercial benefit. So we get all of our electricity from anaerobic digestion plants.
What's an anaerobic digestion plant?
So it takes waste food and converts the waste food into electricity.
Where's that? Is that part of your facility, that anaerobic?
It's co-located, so it's under common ownership, and it's right next door. So the waste food goes into the anaerobic digestion plants, and the two products of that anaerobic digestion are electricity and hot water. So there's waste hot water from pasteurization cycles, and we use that hot water for heating, and we also use that hot water for cooling. And cooling is super important for glasshouses for two reasons. One, they get really hot in the summer, and actually British weather is good from that perspective because our summers aren't too hot, which causes all sorts of problems in other territories. And the other thing we use cold water for is dehumidification, and humidity is the enemy of cannabis because it leads to powdery mildew and botrytis, which is devastating.
Okay.
So we use the hot water as a waste product, and then we get guaranteed eco-friendly electrons because we know exactly where they're coming from, because they're coming from literally across the road from our facility.
It's carbon negative as well.
So we say we're carbon negative because actually in taking the waste food, we're preventing that waste food from rotting in landfill. That would then create methane. Methane is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Okay.
So every methane molecule that we've avoided going to the atmosphere and converted into a carbon dioxide molecule to make electricity saves 27 equivalents going into the atmosphere and creating greenhouse warming effect.
I might need to read some of that to digest it more thoroughly.
Yeah. So actually, when people just a little slight distraction.
Yeah.
So when we say decarbonisation, actually carbon is almost like a unit of currency. In the Kyoto Treaty, carbon dioxide was actually the least powerful greenhouse effect gas that compared to all the others. So that's methane is a good example, which is 28 times more powerful. If you look at some of the chlorofluorocarbons that used in fridges, they're thousands of times more powerful than carbon dioxide. If you look at nitrous oxides, which get emitted by cars, there's no carbon in that at all, but it's a greenhouse gas, which is many times the equivalent of a carbon dioxide molecule. So carbon doesn't mean carbon.
Okay.
It's just a unit of currency or units of measurement of global warming potential.
You said greenhouse. It is a big greenhouse, isn't it?
Ours is a big greenhouse, but it's actually almost like an indoor grow with a glass roof, because the level of control that we have compared to a standard greenhouse is a different level.
And when we talk about volume, I mentioned Releaf. In March, we've got space to see 2,400 new patients.
Yes.
We have patients coming back every month for repeat prescriptions. You have to see a doctor again for your first follow-up.
Yes.
And then you can self-serve the next two. So in our clinic on busy days today, if you include new patients coming on board and patients returning for their first follow-up, we can see 350, 360, I think, have been some of the busier days in the clinic. And one of the concerns we had is, how do we ensure that we partnered with a facility that was able to cope with our growth? Because we mentioned the numbers. Australia's got 1 million people legalised at the same time as us. We've only got 50,000. Any other territory, 3% of adult populations, that's several million in the UK. We've only got 50,000. Some of the conditions that we're incredibly effective at treating, such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD, chronic pain. There are 23 million people in the UK with chronic pain. So the addressable market is undoubtedly in the millions.
Yes.
What scale can you get to?
Well, we have a 2.4 hectare site.
Okay.
So
what's that, football pitches?
I don't know how many football pitches, 250,000 square feet. I mean, it's a large, it's a large and impressive site. And that means that our capacity is huge. So we're operating at 10 to 15% capacity at the moment.
10 to 15?
Yes. And we can ramp that up steadily or less steadily depending on demand. But I think it's fair to say that we, in that facility, could produce all of the medical cannabis flower for the UK market as it stands today.
How much would that be in kilograms, if that's some way of trying to visualize?
So the site, as it stands at the moment, could produce over a ton of medical cannabis flower, dried flower. And we can double that capacity.
A ton, how often?
Every month.
Every month.
And we could double that on the same site.
It's growing at 20%. Doesn't scare you in any way, size, shape or form. I'm almost embarrassed about the lack of patients we see. And one of the things that consistency and quality of supply has given that patient population, because we know they speak to each other, is how do you create a runway for someone who's really not very well, whatever their condition is, to try something that is called cannabis that may or may not have a stigma to them. We've found an incredibly effective way in terms of the digital ecosystem that we've created. So at any one time on Releaf's website, you'll see 700 people actively browsing through the website. If you visualize a shop with 700 people in it, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
We'll see over 200,000 unique visitors in a month. We're the most visited medical cannabis website in the UK. And what we try and do is connect a patient with a condition. If you've got a condition and you're a sensible person, you will probably Google that condition to find out more. If you've been to see a traditional doctor and they've provided you with mainstream pharmaceuticals, medication for your condition, you probably will have Googled the medication. So we try to appear on the search engine results pages above the NHS when you Google a condition or when you Google a medication. And then when we bring you to the website, Peter Zaunier, who is our Chief Marketing Officer, has a rolling campaign of engagement in testimonials and video testimonials of patients on the website. So if you Google a condition and then you see our advert on the search engine results page, when you click through, you actually land on a page where you've got people that look like you, sound like you, live like you. And they have this way of explaining it, which I think Peter calls feel, felt, found. So they have this way, they go, I understand how you feel, James. I felt like that. But what I found was, and I think that if we can get more patients to the facility to continue to re-invoice, because there should be the loudest voice, okay, in terms of education and awareness. And I think that education and awareness, because of the incumbents and the way they went at it, which was let's go and sell people cannabis rather than let's go and find people with conditions that cannabis can help and educate and create this level of awareness. What do you think about the level of education and awareness there is? How many people do you think know that you've got a medical cannabis farm in
Yeah, I mean, we obviously keep the location confidential, but I think the general awareness of medical cannabis in the UK is low. I think if you did a survey on the street and asked them whether medical cannabis was legal, most people would say no.
Most people think it's CBD. Certainly in
Yes.
my network, if I say it's medical cannabis.
You know, people, just like you, people ask me what I do. In the past, nobody was interested in the stuff I was doing, because it was print or it was technology of some, and people started glazing over very quickly. Now everybody wants to understand what I do, because I'm in the medical cannabis sphere. And the first thing that people say to me, "Oh, CBD," and I say, "No, it's definitely not CBD."
Yeah.
And actually, when I was discussing with my wife in the early days, who was very nervous about me entering into this,
being a GP herself,
being a GP herself. No, we spoke about the endocannabinoid system, and sadly, it's not something our doctors get educated on.
I was told that the endocannabinoid system is not on the syllabus for doctors going through medical school in the UK.
Yes.
Do you think we're the only territory that doesn't have the endocannabinoid system on the syllabus?
I think most territories now do teach their doctors about the endocannabinoid system. And it's not a particularly well understood system even now. It was only discovered in the 1990s. So
the endocannabinoid system was only discovered in the 1990s?
Yes. So the endocannabinoids and the receptors were only characterized in the 90s and noughties. So, it takes a while for these things to percolate through and become and go onto syllabuses. But I think it's fair to say that medical syllabuses are jam-packed. The medicine gets more complicated every year, and so to find space on medical syllabuses is challenging. But I do think that given the number of endocannabinoid senses and its fundamental action in the body, it should be part of our education for medics and for pharmacists.
And the nature of the endocannabinoid system being throughout the body. Now, I'm no clinician, right? So I'm at the edge of my understanding here. My understanding is that, for instance, opioid receptors are only in your brain.
Yes.
So we're incredibly proactive in trying to get the message out to the people who had, and the numbers are frankly shocking, 60 million opioid prescriptions last year for 5 million people. And often, you're not treating the root cause, which was chronic pain. You're just trying to get the brain to not feel the chronic pain, which is why you get that dullified view of the world and the addiction to opioids. Do you have any commentary around?
As I mentioned, I'm a chemist by training, which doesn't mean a pharmacist.
Right.
I was an organic chemist, but when I grew up, it was a single molecule that had to be chirally pure, and that was developed as a drug. Cannabis is somewhat different because it's a multi-pharmacy product. It's got a whole cocktail of different compounds.
Yeah.
And actually, when somebody mentioned the entourage effect to me the first time, I thought, what's this?
For our listeners, when people say the entourage effect, just explain for everybody what people are referring to.
Well, the entourage effect was the interaction between the different components of medical cannabis.
The sum of the parts gave you a...
Yes. And, for me as a classically trained scientist, this sounded like snake oil sales.
Yeah.
And over time, as I've read more and more papers, there is a clear interaction between the terpenes in medical cannabis and the cannabinoids. They can't be entirely separated.
And where does THC and CBD fall into this conversation? So
THC is the psychoactive compound in cannabis, which gives people highs. So it's the plant will create THC and CBD from a common starting point, but the combination of THC and CBD, the combination of those compounds and terpenes can give really therapeutic effects. And it's remarkable how something with the same THC concentration can have markedly different effects on people.
But that's the same for all drugs. Any
Yes.
drug that you're prescribed by a doctor will affect you differently than it affects me.
But some terpenes like myrcene and caryophyllene will have a soporific effect, and some terpenes such as pinene and limonene will have an uplifting effect.
But terpenes aren't just found in cannabis.
terpenes are not just found in cannabis; they're found in lots of different plants. They're the hops, which are a close cousin to cannabis. Hops have lots of terpenes in, humulene being one of the primary ones, and that's what gives hops its characteristic taste. So hops to beer, what grapes are to wine, they're what gives it its flavour. And without hops, you wouldn't have a very tasty beer at all.
And so you do sign up to the Entourage effect.
Now I am converted to the Entourage effect, right. And I'm also converted to the safety of cannabis. So for me, I wouldn't want to be involved in an industry that's creating harm. I think there are definitely some patients that shouldn't have cannabis. So if you're young, so under somewhere between 21 and 25, depending on who
your brain's not fully formed to your 25.
You've got an immature brain, and it needs to be, you need to be very careful about those about prescribing it. Sometimes it's absolutely the right thing, but you need to be super careful.
Yep.
And people who've got a history of drug addiction ought to also not enter into taking cannabis lightly. But generally, for people who aren't predisposed to psychosis or have a history of psychosis or are young, it's a relatively safe drug, and certainly much safer than opioids. So if you think about what the drug that kills the most people in America, it is a prescription drug called fentanyl, which is an opioid, and it's at epidemic levels, whereas you don't see epidemic levels of deaths from cannabis. I went to a medical conference, and one of the consultants said that inhaling cannabis is safe. The only way someone's going to die from it is if you take a ton of it and drop it on their head. So it still needs to be prescribed responsibly, but relatively speaking, compared to pregabalin, compared to opioids, compared to lots of other drugs that might be used for chronic pain or some of the other indications that medical cannabis is used for, it's much safer.
And I say again, go to Releaf. Anybody listening to this, to our Trustpilot reviews, you'll see the number of people that have chosen this over opioids, and it's fundamentally changed their lives.
And some of the stories are incredibly heartwarming.
Yeah. And trying to build on those heartwarming stories is the front end of the onboarding process, the governance around some of the things you've talked about to make sure that we are prescribing safely. So Rupa Shah's our compliance director, and working closely with, and I mentioned him before, Graham Woodward, who runs the clinic as our chief operating officer. The attention to detail to ensure that you do qualify for medical cannabis, because there are some rules. You've got to have had a condition that you've been had 2 prescription drugs provided in what you would consider mainstream medical solutions. Yes. And they don't have to be 2 prescription drugs. You could have had a prescription drug and a series of chiropractic treatments to try and I don't know how that changes over time, but certainly the protection and governance and the checks and balances that are in place to ensure safe prescribing all the way through from being integrated with the NHS. So we access your summary care record, your medical history. AI reads that medical history, says that you qualify. You then sit in front of a remote consultation with a highly trained doctor on a screen. That doctor follows the strictest prescribing guidelines, so you get continuity of outcome, which I think is what we're seeing when you follow that through to those Trustpilot reviews. And again, I don't think the industry's been there in the past, where you have these stories that you can go to a clinic and they'll send you an Excel spreadsheet with 100 different names of weird and wonderful plants on it and ask you to choose. I question if that is really meeting an unmet healthcare need.
It's it's a controlled drug.
Yep.
It's a prescription medicine, and it's an unlicensed medicine. So at the end of the day, it's the physician's risk what is being prescribed. So for me, it's incredibly important it's done properly, and done properly, it's a relatively safe drug compared to lots of other alternatives.
Well, it's been great chatting today, James, and I think we've covered some of the things that we drop in and out of through the interactions through the working week. I think we've got a shared vision. You know, the addressable market is in the millions. The root cause of the stagnation has been the way the market represented itself, and it wasn't about cannabis, it was actually about healthcare.
Yes.
And the broken supply chain that was certainly a barrier to our scale, as I mentioned earlier, when we broke the supply chain in March. And, you know, the serendipity of you seeking a provider of healthcare, not a portal that sold cannabis, at the same time that we were seeking a consistent quality of supply, that it being domestic was even more appealing. I think lies at the root cause is certainly Releaf's success.
Yes.
And there's no reason why we can't have 1 million patients in the next few years. There's a pent-up demand, there's an unmet healthcare need. As soon as we release more capacity into the clinic, it fills.
Yes.
And the only measure for me is patient outcome. Again, read Trustpilot. I don't know what your reflections are. James, the vision for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the slow growth of the sector has been due to the patient experience, which Releaf is very much tackling. It's to do with the inconsistency of the product. I think it's also been because of the nervousness of the regulators.
Yep.
And I think in terms of a joint vision, having an industry that looks like a medical industry, behaves like a medical industry, and it indeed is a medical industry is super important to the regulators. So we want the MHRA to be comfortable that this is a bona fide medical a medical process. We want the same thing from the Home Office. We want the Home Office to see, you know, this isn't recreational cannabis by the back door. This is a genuine medical need that's being met. I think when the regulators are satisfied that this is a real industry and we're tackling real medical needs, then they will let us operate more freely, still controlled but more freely. I think when patients see that this is something which really benefit them in a sustained fashion, then they're gonna be happier. I think the medics will get involved more and more as they get educated and as they see really good patient outcomes.
And I think that takes us to perhaps a timely end. You know, to talk about it, doing it properly, we're doing something properly. You know, we're onboarding more patients this month than arguably the entire industry will do collectively. It's growing and growing and growing. Your support has been fabulous and has been at the root cause of our success, and obviously contributes to the success that you're having in Glass Pharm and it being introduced into other clinics, not just Releaf clinics. That's been fun chatting today, James. We covered some ground, I think.
It's been a great partnership, and long may it continue.
Long may it continue. Thank you very much for your time today. Cheers. Thanks.